Dear viewers, the events of these 3 extraordinary days this week demonstrate that the winds of power in North America have completely shifted. On January 14th, US Ambassador Pete Hoekstra sat in a Montreal radio studio and declared with great confidence that America did not need Canada. This statement was made bluntly and without regret, as if Canada's economic importance were somehow optional in Washington's calculations. 48 hours later, Prime Minister Mark Carney stood in Beijing's Great Hall of the People and signed a historic trade partnership agreement with President Xi Jinping, opening a $4 billion door in the canola markets and fundamentally restructuring Canada's economic independence. Immediately afterward, without waiting for celebrations, Carney boarded another plane. His destination was Doha, Qatar, where he secured commitments described as significant strategic investments in Canada's infrastructure, energy systems, and advanced technology sectors. 3 days, 3 seismic moves, and suddenly, Hoekstra's statement began to look less like confident policy and more like a dreamer who was about 72 hours too late. Let us be absolutely clear about the choreography of these events, because timing in geopolitics is never accidental. When Ambassador Hoekstra made his statement on CJAD 800 radio, he was defending President Trump's recent comments at a Ford factory in Michigan, where Trump suggested American manufacturing could easily replace Canadian automotive production. Hoekstra emphasized the word need repeatedly, as if repetition would somehow make the assertion more credible. He acknowledged decades of deeply integrated supply chains under NAFTA and CUSMA, but insisted those relationships were effectively discretionary, subject to renegotiation or complete restructuring depending on American priorities. The mandatory CUSMA review approaches this fall, and Hoekstra positioned the United States as holding all negotiating leverage. He warned that if Canada continued pursuing what he called problematic trade partnerships, particularly with China, then American borders might become considerably less porous for Canadian goods. The subtext was unmistakable: behave predictably, align with American preferences, or face economic consequences. Except Mark Carney was not in Ottawa waiting nervously for Washington's approval when these warnings were issued. He was already in Beijing, already in active negotiations with Chinese leadership, already finalizing agreements that would dramatically reduce Canada's vulnerability to American economic pressure. The China deal announced on January 16th represents the first Canadian Prime Ministerial visit to Beijing since 2017, ending years of strained relations that began with the Meng Wanzhou extradition crisis. Under this agreement, Canada will allow up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles annually at a tariff rate of just 6.1%, down from the punitive 100% tariff imposed in 2024. In exchange, China committed to lowering canola seed tariffs from a crushing 84% to approximately 15% by March 1st. That change alone reopens a $4 billion market for Canadian prairie farmers. But the agreement extends far beyond agriculture. It includes comprehensive tariff relief on Canadian lobster, crab, peas, and canola meal, while establishing frameworks for cooperation in clean energy, forestry, and strategic materials. Perhaps most significantly, President Xi committed to visa-free travel access for Canadians, a gesture that signals Beijing's interest in deeper long-term engagement. Carney described the partnership as realistic, respectful, and interest-based, a framework built for the world as it actually exists today, rather than the world Washington wishes still existed. Now turn your attention to what happened next, because this is where Carney's strategy reveals its full sophistication. Rather than returning to Ottawa to manage domestic political reactions to the China deal, the Prime Minister flew directly to Doha, making him the first sitting Canadian Prime Minister to ever visit Qatar. This was not ceremonial diplomacy. This was capital acquisition at the highest level. Qatar represents the 3rd largest economy in the Gulf region, with a GDP approaching $290 billion. And more importantly, Qatar controls one of the world's most patient and sophisticated sovereign wealth funds. The Qatar Investment Authority manages assets exceeding $400 billion and actively seeks stable, rule-based jurisdictions for long-horizon infrastructure investments, exactly the kind of capital that builds energy grids, finances liquefied natural gas terminals, and underwrites the physical transformation of national economies. Carney met with Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani and secured what both leaders described as significant strategic investments in Canadian nation-building projects. The joint statement committed both countries to accelerated cooperation across artificial intelligence, quantum computing, aerospace, advanced manufacturing, and defense technologies. Canada and Qatar agreed to conclude negotiations on a foreign investment promotion and protection agreement by summer 2026, priced a framework that will formalize investment security and eliminate remaining regulatory barriers. Current two-way trade between Canada and Qatar exceeds $325 million annually, with Quebec accounting for nearly half of Canadian exports, driven primarily by aerospace and advanced manufacturing sectors. But here is what makes this truly consequential. Qatar's investment in Canada is already growing at nearly 20% per year. And that growth rate preceded this week's announcements. With formal investment protections in place and explicit government-level commitments secured, that growth trajectory is positioned to accelerate dramatically. Consider what this means strategically. Canada is systematically constructing alternative capital channels that operate entirely outside American financial influence. When Washington threatens trade restrictions or border complications, Canada can now point to secured financing from Gulf sovereign wealth, combined with guaranteed market access in China for critical agricultural and resource exports. The energy dimension deserves particular emphasis. Carney stated explicitly during his Doha meetings that Canada will double its electrical grid capacity over the next 15 years and scale liquefied natural gas production to 50 million tons annually by 2030, with all LNG exports destined for Asian markets. Qatar possesses unmatched expertise in LNG infrastructure development and has expressed interest in partnership investments, including offshore wind projects that will anchor Canada's renewable energy transition. These are not speculative ventures. These are concrete commitments with timelines, capital allocations, and operational frameworks. The agreements also address security cooperation, with both nations committing to establish a defense, security, and intelligence framework, including military training programs. Canada intends to establish a resident defense attaché presence in Doha, formalizing military-to-military channels that enhance strategic coordination. Qatar will provide security cooperation expertise for the 2026 FIFA World Cup, building on their experience hosting the 2022 tournament. The cultural and mobility dimensions matter as well. In November 2025, Canada removed visa requirements for Qatari citizens and introduced electronic travel authorization, facilitating business travel and investment coordination. Nearly 10,000 Canadians currently live and work in Qatar, contributing across aerospace, artificial intelligence, defense, and agri-food sectors, creating organic networks that support deeper commercial integration. 2026 marks Qatar's Year of Culture with Canada, an initiative designed to strengthen people-to-people ties and build the soft power foundations that sustain long-term partnerships. Carney extended formal invitations for both the Emir and Qatar's Prime Minister to visit Canada later this year, ensuring momentum continues at the highest political levels. Now, some will argue, and indeed Ontario Premier Doug Ford has argued loudly, that opening Canadian markets to Chinese electric vehicles threatens domestic automotive manufacturing and risks antagonizing Washington at precisely the wrong moment. The criticism misses several essential points. First, Canada imposed those EV tariffs in lockstep with American policy in 2024, and that alignment produced exactly zero goodwill or leverage protection from Trump's administration. Second, the China agreement includes explicit provisions requiring that by 2030, over 50% of imported vehicles must be affordable models priced below $35,000, creating genuine consumer access to electric mobility that Canadian and American manufacturers have systematically failed to provide. Third, and perhaps most important, the agreement positions Canada as an attractive destination for Chinese automotive investment and manufacturing presence within North America. Multiple Chinese manufacturers have already expressed interest in establishing Canadian production facilities to serve both domestic and export markets. This creates jobs, generates tax revenue, and builds industrial capacity that reduces, rather than increases, dependence on any single trading partner. But here is the cruel irony that Ambassador Hoekstra seems unable to grasp. Every threat Washington issues, every dismissive statement about not needing Canada, every suggestion that CUSMA is somehow optional, it all accelerates the very diversification process that diminishes American leverage. Carney is not rejecting the United States. He's simply refusing to accept that Canadian economic policy requires American permission. And that refusal, backed by secured capital and guaranteed market access elsewhere, fundamentally transforms the negotiating dynamic. What we witnessed this week was not diplomatic theater. It was the operational execution of economic autonomy. Mark Carney demonstrated in 72 hours what confident middle-power statecraft looks like in a fragmenting global system. He secured market access where it was denied, attracted capital where it was needed, and built partnerships based on mutual interest rather than inherited assumptions. The infrastructure investments committed by Qatar will not vanish if Washington applies pressure. The trade channels opened with China will not close because American ambassadors expressed disapproval. These are durable, institutional arrangements designed to outlast political cycles and rhetorical posturing. Ambassador Hoekstra declared that America does not need Canada. Perhaps that is true, but Canada just proved decisively that it no longer needs to ask America's permission. And in the calculus of 21st century power, optionality trumps proximity every single time. Canada no longer needs to ask for permission.